I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was late December, the time of year when Manhattan tries to hide its grime under a layer of slush, and everyone acts like they're in a race to buy things they don't need. Inside the brownstone, the atmosphere was, as usual, dictated by the thermometer and the kitchen clock. Nero Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, probably telling a phalaenopsis that its color was vulgar, and I was in the office, wondering if I could talk Fritz into making a batch of those little pigs in blankets for a late snack. The disturbance started at exactly 9:14 p.m. It wasn't the doorbell, it was a sound that had no business being on our stoop. It was a choir, not a recording and not a group of kids looking for a dime, but a full-throated, professional-grade rendition of God Rest Ye Merry, gentleman that was loud enough to vibrate the glass in the front door. I went to the hall, feeling the twitch in my jaw that usually means someone is about to be disappointed. I peered through the one-way glass. There were 6 of them, dressed in Dickensian capes and top hats, looking like they had just stepped out of a Christmas card. But they weren't looking at the neighbors. They were looking directly at our door. I opened it just as they hit the final chord. The cold air rushed in, smelling of damp wool and exhaust. "Top marks for harmony," I said, leaning against the frame. "But if you're looking for a donation, the man of the house only gives to the underprivileged, in the form of orchids and high-quality beer. And he prefers his music via the radio, where he can turn it off." A woman in the center, wearing a velvet bonnet that looked like it cost more than my first suit, stepped forward. She didn't look like a caroler. She looked like a CEO who had lost her way to a boardroom. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and decidedly unfestive. "I am not here for a donation, Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice a cultivated contralto. "My name is Elena Vane. Tell Mr. Wolfe that the Midnight Carol has been stolen and the composer is dead. Tell him that if he does not see me, the last copy will be burned by midnight." I stood there for a second. The name Vane rang a bell. The Vane Music Foundation was one of those old money institutions that own half the real estate in Midtown. And the Midnight Carol was a legendary lost manuscript by a composer named Julian Thorne, a guy who had vanished in the 40s and whose work was now worth a fortune to the right people. "Wait here," I said. I didn't wait for her to agree. I went back into the office and buzzed the plant rooms. It was past Wolfe's usual hours for visitors, and interrupting his evening session with the orchids is roughly equivalent to poking a sleeping bear with a very short stick. "Yes, Archie?" The voice was a low, disgruntled rumble. "We have a Dickensian choir on the stoop," I said. "The lead singer is Elena Vane. She says the Midnight Carol is missing, the composer is dead, and there's a bonfire scheduled for midnight. She seems to think you're the only fire extinguisher in town." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears of Wolfe's massive brain shifting from botany to betrayal. Julian Thorne's music was one of the few things Wolfe actually respected besides a well-cooked rack of lamb. "Bring her in, Archie. But tell the others they are to wait in the hall. I will not have my office turned into a rehearsal space." I went back to the door and ushered Elena Vane inside. The 5 other carolers stood in the hall like frozen statues. I led her into the office, where the lights were low and the smell of old books and leather was thick enough to chew on. She sat in the red leather chair, her velvet bonnet looking out of place against the mahogany. Wolfe entered a minute later, his yellow silk vest appearing in the doorway, like a stationary sun. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to his desk, sat in the chair that had been specially reinforced to handle his 1/7 bulk, and adjusted his blotter. "Miss Vane," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that melodic, dangerous tone he uses when he's interested but doesn't want you to know it. "You suggest that a manuscript that has been missing for 80 years has suddenly appeared, only to vanish again on Christmas Eve?" "It didn't just appear, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her hands trembling slight. Lee in her muff. "My grandfather was Thorne's patron. He hid the manuscript to protect it from the family. I found it yesterday in a secret compartment in the Van Library. And 3 hours ago, while we were preparing for the Foundation's gala, someone broke into the safe. They left a charred fragment of the first page on my desk." Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. He reached for a bottle of beer on his desk, but he didn't open it. "And why come to me? The police enjoy a good theft." "The police would ask questions I cannot answer," she whispered. And the fragment they left, it wasn't just burned, it was marked with a symbol, the same symbol Julian Thorne used before he committed suicide. Someone wants to erase him, Mr. Wolfe, and they are using my family to do it. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers tap-tap-tapping against the arms of his chair. The sanctity of the brownstone had been disturbed by a ghost of a song for reasons he wasn't going to share with me yet. He was hooked. "Archie," Wolfe said, looking at the clock, "get your coat. Miss Vane will stay here. I want you at the Vane Foundation within the hour. If there is a bonfire planned for midnight, we have exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes to find the match." I reached for my hat. The Midnight Carol Conundrum was officially open, and the harmony on the stoop was about to turn into a very loud discord. The transition from the stoop to the office was handled with the kind of stiff-necked ceremony usually reserved for state funerals. Elena Vane walked into our inner sanctum with her chin held high, but the way she gripped that velvet muff told me she was about 5 minutes away from a complete collapse. The 5 carolers she had brought with her remained in the hallway, standing in a row like decorative nutcrackers. They didn't speak, and they didn't move, which made the entryway feel more like a stage set than a part of a home. I could see Fritz peeking through the kitchen door, his face a mask of polite disapproval. To Fritz, the hallway is a transition zone for groceries and legitimate guests, not a storage area for operatic trespassers in top hats. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his eyes travelling over Elena Vane with a look that suggested he was examining a particularly difficult specimen of Cattleya. He hadn't touched his beer yet, which is always a sign that he's mentally checking the locks on the doors. The disruption of his evening was a weight in the room, a physical presence that seemed to make the shadows in the corners darker. "You mentioned a symbol, Miss Vane," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, lethal precision. "Describe it." She reached into her muff and pulled out a small glassine envelope. Inside was a scrap of thick, cream-coloured paper, charred at the edges. I leaned over to look. It was a fragment of musical staff, the notes written in a frantic, spidery hand. Over the centre of the bar was a mark drawn in dark red ink, a circle with a vertical line slashing through it and 2 dots on either side. It looked like a stylized eye that had seen something it shouldn't have. "The Thorne mark," Wolfe murmured, his eyes narrowing. Julian Thorne believed his music was being hunted. He claimed that a secret society, the Discordant, wanted to suppress his work because it contained frequencies that were unsettling to the status quo. 1944 critics considered him a lunatic. He was found dead in a locked room, and the Midnight Carol was assumed to have been burned with him. "My grandfather didn't think he was mad," Elena said, her voice trembling. "He was Thorne's only friend. He spent 40 years researching this manuscript, and now that I've found it, the room where I kept it has been ransacked. The carolers you see in your hall, they are the only people who knew I had found it. They are my board members, my inner circle. One is a traitor, Mr. Wolfe, and one of them is a thief." I looked through the open office door at the quintet in the hall. A choir of suspects, I noted. It's a nice touch. Usually, people just bring their lawyers. "Why the costumes? We were supposed to perform the carol at the Foundation Gala at midnight," she explained. "It was to be the surprise of the century. We were in the middle of a dress rehearsal at my townhouse when the lights went out. When they returned, the library vault was open. The manuscript was gone, and that scrap was sitting on the velvet." Wolfe's fingers began to tap-tap-tap against the arms of his chair. This was the moment the brownstone felt truly disturbed. It wasn't just the outsiders, it was the fact that a piece of dead history had been brought into our house, and it brought a scent of old wood smoke and ancient grudges with it. Wolfe hates the past when it tries to dictate the present, mostly because the past is the only thing he can't cross-examine. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes finally moving to me, "the outsiders are to remain here, under Fritz's supervision. I want them in the front room, not the hall. They must be given water, but no conversation. You will go to the Varney townhouse. I want a description of the safe, the library, and the exact path the intruder would have taken during the blackout. And Archie, check the piano." "The piano?" I asked, reaching for my coat. "I'm not exactly an ivory tickler, Wolfe. Check the dampers," Wolfe commanded. "If the Thorne mark is involved, this is not a simple theft of paper. It is a psychological assault. Someone is attempting to recreate the 1944 atmosphere. I want to know if the music is truly gone, or if it has merely been displaced. I headed for the hall. I had to weave my way through the 5 carolers to get to the front door. Up close, they looked less like singers and more like mourners. There was a thin, nervous man with a twitchy eye, a woman with jewels that looked like they'd been inherited from a czarina, a burly fellow with a neck like a bull, and 2 others who looked like they'd be plucked from a university faculty lounge. They all watched me leave with a mixture of suspicion and hope, as if I were the one holding the missing notes. The air outside was freezing, the snow turning to a fine, stinging dust. As I climbed into the Heron, I looked back at the brownstone. The office lights were still burning bright, a golden island in a city of grey shadows. Inside, Wolfe was sitting in his chair, a massive conductor about to start a symphony of suspicion. The discord had entered our home, and by the time the clock struck midnight, I had a feeling that Midnight Carol was going to be the last thing anyone wanted to hear. I pulled away from the curb, my mind on the thorn mark and the locked room of 1944. The sanctity of the brownstone had been breached, and for Nero Wolfe, that was the one note that always needed to be resolved. By the time I reached the Vane A townhouse on East 64th Street, the snow was coming down in thick, silent flakes that made the city look like a muffled stage set. The house was one of those narrow, 5-story limestone structures that seemed to be held together by old money and sheer social inertia. Inside, the lights were all blazing, casting long, nervous shadows across the marble foyer. I didn't need a key. The front door was being guarded by a private security type who looked like he'd been told he was responsible for the end of the world. I gave him the name and the look that usually gets me past velvet ropes, and I made my way to the library. It was a room that smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the lingering bitter scent of a blown fuse. The safe was a heavy, wall-mounted Victorian monster that had been disguised behind a portrait of a Vane A ancestor who looked like he'd never smiled a day in his life. The door was hanging open, the steel inner workings exposed like the guts of a broken clock. But it wasn't the safe that held the tension, it was the people, or rather, the ghosts of the people who had been here 3 hours ago. I sat at a mahogany table and pulled out the list Elena Vane had provided. The inner circle wasn't just a choir, it was a collection of rivalries bound together by the Vane Music Foundation. First on the list was Arthur Sterling, the nervous man with the twitchy eye I'd seen in our hall. He was the foundation's treasurer, a man who treated every penny like it was a drop of his own blood. Elena had noted that Sterling was dead set against the Julian Thorne discovery because the cost of authenticating and marketing a lost manuscript would bankrupt the legacy. He had a motive as clear as a ledger, no manuscript, no deficit. Then there was Beatrice Thorne, a distant cousin of the dead composer. She was the woman with the czarina jewels. She believed the Midnight Carol belonged to her branch of the family by right of blood, not to the foundation. She had been vocal about her plan to sell it to a private collector in London, someone who would bury it in a vault forever. For her, the manuscript was a paycheck with too many zeros to ignore. Third was Dr. Victor Graves, the burly fellow with the bull neck. He was a musicologist who had built his entire career on the theory that Julian Thorne had never written a Midnight Carol at all. If the manuscript was real, Graves was a laughingstock. If it stayed lost, he remained the preeminent expert on a mystery he claimed didn't exist. Finally, there were the twins, Marcus and Silas Vance, the faculty lounge types. They were the Foundation's archivists. They lived for the hunt, but they lived even more for the control of information. They had been the ones to verify the secret compartment in the library. They were the gatekeepers, and gatekeepers always hate it when someone else finds the key. I walked over to the grand piano in the corner, a Steinway that probably cost more than a suburban house. I remembered Wolfe's instructions and lifted the lid. The dampers were fine, but when I looked closer at the felt, I saw it. Tucked beneath the strings of the middle C was a small white business card. I pulled it out with my handkerchief. It didn't have a name. It had the thorn mark, that stylized eye, drawn in the same dark red ink. And beneath it, a single line of music, 3 notes, a descending minor third. The ensemble of enemies was starting to hum. I could see the lines of tension connecting them all to this room, to the safe, and to the missing music. Sterling wanted the money. Beatrice wanted the lega. Sigh. Graves wanted his reputation, and the twins wanted the secret. Each had been in the room when the lights went out. They each knew the vault's secret. I went back to the safe and examined the lock. It hadn't been forced. It had been opened with the combination, or a very lucky guess by someone who knew the cadence of the Vane family history. The blackout had been a simple matter of a tripped breaker in the basement, an easy task for anyone who knew where the service panel was hidden. I stood in the center of the library, the silence of the room pressing in on me. The Midnight Carol wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a weapon that had been used to shatter the peace of the Varney household and, by extension, the sanctity of our own brownstone. Wolfe was right. This wasn't a simple theft. It was a psychological deconstruction. I headed back to the Heron, the cold air feeling like a bucket of ice water after the stuffy atmosphere of the townhouse. I had the thorn mark in my pocket and a head full of motives that all pointed toward a midnight disaster. When I got back to 35th Street, I found the office exactly as I'd left it, except that the air was even thicker with the smell of Wolfe's beer and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of 5 carolers trapped in the front room. The piano had a message. "Wolfe," I said, dropping the business card onto his desk. "The Middle C is holding a grudge, and someone who didn't need a crowbar opened the safe. We have a treasurer who hates debt, a cousin who loves cash, an expert who hates being wrong, and 2 archivists who love secrets. Take your pick." Wolfe took the card, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the 3 notes. He didn't speak for long. He just sat there, the master of the house, listening to a symphony that only he could hear. "The minor third," Wolfe whispered, his voice like dry leaves on a sidewalk. "The funeral march interval. They aren't just stealing the music, Archie. They are performing it. And we are the audience. The rhythm of the streets at midnight on Christmas Eve is usually a frantic staccato of last-minute shoppers and revelers, but as I steered the Heron back out into the slush, the city felt like it was holding its breath. Wolfe had sent me back with a specific list of errands that felt more like a scavenger hunt than a murder investigation. I had the names of 3 addresses: a basement apartment in Greenwich Village, a shuttered music shop on 4th Avenue, and a private sanitarium in Upper Manhattan. "The manuscript is not the objective, Archie," Wolfe had told me before I left, his voice as dry as the vellum he was likely imagining. "The objective is the legacy of the thorn mark. Find the man who printed those business cards. In a city of 8 million, there are only 4 shops capable of that specific grade of letterpress on Victorian stock. Start with the one that still uses iron gall ink." My first stop was the village. The air there was thick with the smell of roasting sea, chestnuts and coal smoke. I found the shop, a literal hole in the wall tucked beneath a bakery. The sign said Patterson's, fine engraving, but it looked more like a place where they forged treaties for extinct nations. The man behind the counter was old enough to have known Julian Thorne personally, and he looked at the business card I'd found in the Steinway with a mixture of professional respect and genuine terror. "The thorn mark," he whispered, his fingers trembling as he touched the red ink. "I haven't seen this since 44. A man came 2 days ago, tall, very thin, wearing a coat that looked like it had been pulled from a theatre trunk. He didn't give a name. He gave a gold coin and a hand-drawn sketch. He wanted 50 cards by tonight. He said Midnight Carol was finally ready for its premiere." "Did he say where the premiere was?" I asked, leaning against a stack of wedding invitations. He didn't need to. "He said the music would find its way to the one house in New York where the beer is cold and the logic is colder." I assumed he meant the Vane Foundation, but now I'm not so sure. I left the shop and headed for the second address, the music shop on 4th Avenue. It was closed, but I knew the owner, a guy named Solly who lived in the back and had a memory like a filing cabinet for every sheet of music sold in the city since the armistice. I hammered on the service door until a light flickered on. "Thorn?" Solly grunted when I showed him the notes on the card. "That's the opening motif of Carol, all right, but there's a mistake. Thorn always resolved that minor third with a major fourth. This is the black version, the one he wrote while he was in the sanitarium. It's supposed to be a curse, Goodwin, not a song. Who's been asking about curses lately, Solly?" "Avery Sterling, the treasurer. He was here last week looking for the original sketches Thorne made before the Vanes took him in. He seemed desperate, said he needed to prove that the music was a fraud before the inner circle did something stupid. The rhythm was picking up. Sterling wasn't just worried about the budget, he was trying to prove the music was dangerous. I drove north, the snow turning into a blinding white curtain that made the headlights of the Heron look like two dying stars. The sanitarium was a grim Victorian pile that had been converted into luxury apartments in the 50s, but the old records were still kept in a damp basement vault. It took 20 minutes and a $10 bill to look at Julian Thorne's file. There were no medical notes, those had been purged decades ago, but there was an inventory of his personal effects from the night he died. One fountain pen, one silver metronome, and a single sealed envelope addressed to the man who listens. The envelope was gone, noted as having been collected by a representative of the Varney estate in 1946. I checked my watch. It was 11:05 p.m. The 2-hour and 40-minute window was close. I drove back to the brownstone, my mind spinning with the image of a man in a theatre coat and a treasurer looking for a curse. When I walked back into the office, the 5 carolers were still in the front room, their silence now so heavy it was practically a 6th person in the room. Wolfe was in his chair, his eyes closed. He looked like he was asleep, but I knew better. He was listening to the city. I dropped the Patterson business card and Solly's notes on his desk. The black version, Wolfe, I said, catching my breath. Sterling was looking for proof that the carol is a curse, and the composer left a letter for the man who listens that the Vanes scooped up 40 years ago. Someone is performing a play and they've been rehearsing for half a century. Wolfe opened his eyes. They weren't sleepy, they were bright with a cold, predatory light. He looked at the clock. 11:12 p.m. The man who listens, Wolfe murmured, his lips moving in that rhythmic pout. Julian Thorne was not a madman, Archie. He was an observer. He knew the Varney family was built on a foundation of stolen melodies. He didn't write a carol to celebrate them. He wrote a requiem to expose them, and the inner circle knows it. That is why they are here, not to find the music, but to ensure that I am the one who destroys it for them. So we're the bonfire? I asked. No, Wolfe said, standing up with a sudden, surprising grace. We are the acoustics. Archie, tell Fritz to bring the carolers into the Fice, all of them, and tell him to bring the silver metronome from the basement storage, the one that was left here by the elder Mr. Vane 10 years ago. It is time we find out which of our guests has the best ear for the truth. I headed for the front room. The rhythm of the streets was about to be replaced by the rhythm of a dead man's heart, and I had a feeling that Midnight Carol was about to have its world premiere right in our own office. The office was suddenly far too small for the 6 people now occupying it, not counting the massive presence of the man behind the desk. Fritz had marshaled the 5 carolers in from the front room, and they stood in a ragged semicircle like a chorus, waiting for a conductor who had already decided to fail them. Arthur Sterling's eye was twitching so violently I thought it might leap off his face, while Beatrice Thorne clutched her fur stole, as if it were a shield against the heavy atmosphere of the room. Dr. Graves, the musicologist, looked at Wolfe's bookshelves with a sneer that didn't quite cover the tremor in his hands. The Vance twins stood shoulder to shoulder, their identical expressions of academic boredom beginning to crack around the edges. I brought the silver metronome from the basement. It was a heavy Victorian piece of clockwork, tarnished to the color of a winter sky, but still possessing a lethal-looking pendulum. I set it on the corner of Wolfe's desk, and the sound of it hitting the mahogany was like a gavel. Elena Vane, who had been sitting in the red leather chair throughout the night, let out a small, sharp gasp when she saw it. That belonged to Julian, she whispered. My grandfather said it was lost when the elder Thorne died. How did you get it, Mr. Wolfe? Your grandfather was a man of many secrets, Miss Vane, Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble, including the fact that he trusted no one in his own family, or his own foundation, with the final piece of the composer's legacy. He brought this to me 10 years ago, requesting that I keep it until a specific condition was met. That condition was the discovery of the Midnight Carol manuscript. Wolfe looked at the 5 suspects. His eyes were half closed, but I knew he was watching the way they reacted to the ticking silence of the room. The subtle trespass I had expected was no longer a theory, it had already happened. I noticed it first because I'm the one who cleans the desk blotters. The small brass letter opener that usually sits at a precise 45-degree angle on Wolfe's desk had been moved. It was now pointing directly at the silver metronome. Archie, Wolfe said, not taking his eyes off the group. The metronome, open the bass. I picked up the heavy silver object. It was cold, and it had a strange, unbalanced weight to it. I turned it over and found the small, recessed catch. When I pressed it, the bottom plate didn't just fall off. It slid aside on a well-oiled track. Inside was a small, hollow ember, and in that chamber was a single, folded slip of paper. But it wasn't the paper that caught my eye. It was the fact that the chamber was empty of its primary occupant. "The key is gone, Wolfe," I said, holding the empty metronome up so everyone could see. "There's a mounting bracket for a small barrel-shaped key. It was here recently. I can see the fresh scratch marks on the silver. A subtle trespass indeed," Wolfe remarked, his voice dropping into a register of cold, hard focus. "Someone in this room, during the brief moments when Fritz was preparing the front room for your arrival, found their way into this office. Someone who knew that the metronome was the true vault for the Julian Thorne discovery. Miss Vane, you were in the red leather chair. The others were in the hall. Only a person with an intimate knowledge of this house's geography, or someone with a very keen ear for the movement of the servants, could have slipped in, opened the device, and retrieved the key while my back was turned." Arthur Sterling's face went from pale to a sickly shade of green. "This is absurd. We've been under guard. That man, Fritz, he's been watching us like a hawk." "Fritz is a chef, Mr. Sterling, not a jailer," Wolfe snapped. "And you, as the treasurer, have spent the last decade auditing the Van Estate's payments to this house for clerical storage. You knew exactly where the metronome was kept. You knew its history, and you knew that the manuscript, found in the secret compartment. Tea was useless without the key to the encrypted shorthand Thorne used for the final movement. The pressure in the room was mounting. The midnight carol wasn't just a song, it was a cipher. And the key to that cipher had just been stolen right under our noses." Beatrice Thorne stepped forward, her jewels clashing as she moved. "If there is a key, it belongs to the family. My grandfather was Thorne's blood. If Arthur took it, he's a thief of a different color." "I didn't take it!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking into a high, frantic tenor. "I was looking for the black version. I wanted to destroy it before it destroyed the foundation. Graves, you said music is a curse. You said it would ruin us." Dr. Graves didn't answer. He was staring at the empty metronome with a look of pure academic hunger. The Vance twins were whispering to each other, their eyes darting between the desk and the door. The ensemble was no longer singing in harmony, they were a cacophony of fear and greed. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle. The theft of the key from his own desk was the ultimate insult, a breach of the sanctity of the brownstone that he could not, and would not, ignore. He looked at the clock. 11:34 p.m. The increased pressure was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical weight in the air, a countdown to midnight that promised to be anything but holy. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice as calm as the eye of a hurricane, "the front door is to be bolted and chained. No one leaves. Not the carolers, not the client, not even the ghosts. Someone in this room has the key to the midnight carol in their pocket. And before the clock strikes 12, they're going to perform the final resolution for us, whether they want to or not." I went to the hall and threw the heavy brass bolt. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. The midnight carol was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a confrontation to be survived, and Nero Wolfe was the only one who knew the tempo. The sound of the heavy brass bolt sliding into place seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the hallway. I stood by the door for a moment, making sure the chain was taut, before returning to the office. The atmosphere had shifted from tense consultation to siege. The 5 carolers and Elena Vane were no longer just guests or suspects. They were inhabitants of a pressure cooker, and Nero Wolfe was the one with his hand on the valve. The silver metronome sat empty on the desk, a silent witness to the theft that had occurred right under our noses. Wolfe's face was a granite mask. To an outsider, he looked merely bored, but I could see the slight sharpening of his gaze. A sharp note of danger had been struck, and it wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the fact that someone had dared to treat the brownstone like a common pawn shop. "The key is in this room," Wolfe said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a falling axe. A small, barrel-shaped piece of brass, perhaps an inch long. It is the missing link between a pile of paper and a legacy of absolute truth. Archie, the phone. I handed him the receiver. He dialed a number from memory, one I knew well. It was the private line to Saul Panzer's flat. Saul is the only man Wolfe trusts to see what others ignore, and on a night like this, we needed his eyes. Saul, Wolfe said, I have a collection of vocalists in my office. One of them has committed a trespass. I demand you go to the Patterson engraving shop. The owner mentioned a man in a theatre coat. I believe that coat was not a costume, but a disguise used to mask a specific physical deformity. Check the records of the Vane Foundation's medical pension list from the 1940s. Look for a name that was crossed out but never removed. I will hold the line. While Wolfe waited, the room began to fray. Dr. Graves was pacing the narrow strip of rug in front of the bookshelves, his bull neck turning a deep, angry red. This is illegal, Wolfe. You can't hold us here. We have a gala to attend. The mayor is expecting the foundation board. The mayor will have to settle for a recorded carol, Wolfe remarked, not looking up. And as for the legality, you are currently witnesses to a theft in my home. I am merely ensuring you are available for the police when they arrive. Unless, of course, the thief would like to step forward and save us all the tedious necessity of a search. No one moved. Arthur Sterling's eye was twitching so fast it looked like a shutter on a camera. Beatrice Thorne was breathing in short, shallow gasps, her hand clutching the emeralds at her throat so tightly I thought she might snap the gold wire. The Vance twins were standing perfectly still, but their eyes were darting toward the window, a 20-foot drop into a frozen stone areaway. Suddenly, the lights in the office flickered, a sharp, rhythmic blinking that mimicked the heartbeat of the metronome. Then, a sound drifted in from the hallway. It wasn't the carolers, it was a high, thin whistle, a melody that felt like a needle scratching against a glass plate. It was the same minor third I'd heard in the Van Library, the descending interval of the funeral march. The man who listens, Elena Vane whispered, her face going as white as the snow outside. He's here. He followed us. Don't be ridiculous, Graves barked, though he retreated a step toward Wolfe's desk. Thorne has been dead for 40 years. It's the wind in the chimney. The wind does not whistle in a minor third, Doctor, Wolfe said, his eyes snapping open, and it does not trip the circuit breakers of a house that has been professionally wired. Archie, the hallway. Now, I didn't wait. I had my .38 out before I reached the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the front door. The whistling had stopped, replaced by a soft rhythmic thudding, the sound of someone walking with a heavy, uneven gait. It was coming from the kitchen. I moved toward the back of the house, my heart doing a slow, heavy rhythm of its own. I pushed open the kitchen door and saw Fritz standing by the large prep table, his hands raised. Opposite him, standing by the service entrance, was a figure that looked like a shadow given substance. He was wearing the theatre coat, a long, tattered velvet thing, and a hat that shadowed his face, but it was the way he stood that caught me. One shoulder was significantly higher than the other, giving him a twisted, predatory silhouette. "Drop it," I said, leveling the .38 at his chest. The figure didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small barrel-shaped key. He held it up to the light, and I saw the glint of brass. "The music must be resolved," the man said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like old paper being torn. "The Vanes stole the harmony. They left the discord for the rest of us. It is time for the black version to be heard." Before I could move, he threw the key, not at me, but toward the open cellar door behind Fritz. The small brass object vanished into the darkness of the basement. Then, with a speed that didn't match his lopsided frame, the man lunged for the service door. I fired once, a warning shot that took a chunk out of the doorframe, but he was gone, vanished into the swirling white chaos of the alley. I turned to Fritz. "You okay?" "I am fine, Archie," Fritz said, his voice remarkably steady for a man who'd just stared down a ghost. But he didn't come for the key. He already had it. He came to see if Mr. Wolfe was truly the man who listens. I went back to the office and gave Wolfe the news. The key was in the cellar, the ghost was in the alley, and the midnight carol was currently being performed by the city itself. Wolfe didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. "The sharp note of danger has been struck," Wolfe said, looking at the clock. 11:48 p.m. The second betrayal is complete. Someone in this room let that man into the alley. Someone who knew that I would find the key in the metronome, and who wanted to ensure it never reached the manuscript. Saul just called back. The name on the medical list? It wasn't Thorne, it was Vane, a brother the family didn't want the world to see. The pressure was at its peak, the inner circle was crumbling, and the midnight carol was about to have its final resolution. The conductor's silence in the office was so profound it felt like a physical weight, heavier than the snow piling up against the windows. Wolfe sat motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow that he might have been a statue carved from yellow silk and granite. He was no longer a man in a chair, he was a focal point for all the unresolved tension in the room. The five carolers stood in their tattered Victorian glory, looking like a chorus that had forgotten its lyrics, while Elena Vane gripped the arms of the red leather chair until her knuckles were as white as the IV. Hoary keys of her stolen Steinway. I stood by the door, the smell of cordite from the warning shot in the kitchen still clinging to my suit. The ghost in the theatre coat had vanished into the alley, and the brass key was somewhere in the dark of the basement. But the real mystery was still standing right in front of us. Wolfe's silence was his most potent weapon. He was letting the suspect's own heartbeats do the interrogation for him. He was waiting for the group's internal rhythm to break. "The silence of a conductor," Wolfe said, his voice finally breaking the stillness like a low C on a cello, "is not an absence of sound. It is an invitation to the performers to reveal their true tempo. One of you has been working overtime for 40 years. One of you knew that the ghost in the alley, the discarded Vane brother, was the true keeper of Julian Thorne's sanity. And one of you made a private arrangement to ensure that the midnight carol was never heard tonight. Arthur Sterling, the treasurer, let out a sound that was half sob and half wheeze. I told you, Wolfe, the money, the foundation couldn't survive a scandal. If the world knew that a Vane drove Julian Thorne mad, the endowments would dry up overnight. I didn't want the key, I just wanted the silence. A treasurer's silence is easily bought with a balanced ledger, Mr. Sterling, Wolfe remarked, not opening his eyes. But what of the archivist's silence? Or the musicologist's? Dr. Graves, you spent 20 years writing a book that claimed the Midnight Carol was a myth. If the manuscript is performed tonight, your life's work becomes a footnote in a tragedy. And the Vance twins, you found the secret compartment, didn't you? But you didn't tell Elena. You waited. You waited for a buyer who would pay for the privilege of burning the truth. The Vance twins shifted in unison, their identical faces tightening. "We are conservators, Mr. Wolfe," one of them said, his voice thin and academic. "Sometimes to conserve a legacy, one must prune the dead wood. Julian Thorne was dead wood. He was the root," Elena Vane whispered, her eyes fixed on Wolfe, "and you all tried to kill him twice." Wolfe opened his eyes then. They were bright, cold, and utterly focused. He leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the edge of the desk. "The positioning is complete. You are all here because you believe I am the final obstacle. You believe that by bringing the mystery to this house, you could bury it under the weight of my reputation. You expected me to find a thief. Instead, I have found a conspiracy of mediocrity." He looked at the clock. 11:52 p.m. "Archie, the basement. Fritz has the flashlight. The key is not lost, it was a delivery. The man in the theatre coat didn't throw it away. He threw it to the only place in this house where the foundations are made of stone. He was returning the heart of the music to the man who listens. Go and get it." I went down the cellar stairs, my footsteps echoing into cool, damp air. Fritz was there, holding a heavy torch, its beam cutting through the shadows where we keep the crates of beer and the seasonal preserves. We found the brass key resting on a bed of coal near the furnace. It looked small and insignificant, but when I picked it up, it felt as heavy as a lead pipe. It was the resolution of 80 years of discord. When I returned to the office, the air was vibrating with an almost audible hum. Wolfe had ordered the Vance twins to bring out a portable record player from the front room, one of those high-end models the Foundation used for private auditions. He had the charred fragment of the manuscript on his desk. "The conductor has finished his silence," Wolfe said as I handed him the key. "The performance is about to begin, but it will not be a carol of joy. It will be a strategic exposure of every lie told in the name of the Van Music Foundation. The Midnight Carol is no song, Miss Van. It is a confession. Wolfe took the key and inserted it into the base of the silver metronome, which I now realized was not just a timepiece but a primitive acoustic playback device designed by Thorne himself. As he turned the key, a faint, mechanical whirring began, the sound of a long-dead composer's heartbeat starting to pump again. "The final gathering is at hand," Wolfe announced. "Archie, the lights, we shall listen to the truth in the dark," just as Julian Thorne wrote it. The conductor's silence was over, the symphony of suspicion W. as about to reach its crescendo, and as I reached for the light switch, I saw the 5 suspects move closer together, their Victorian capes fluttering like the wings of trapped birds. The clock began to chime the first stroke of midnight, and the Midnight Carol finally began to play. The office was plunged into a thick velvet darkness that smelled of cold wax and the lingering scent of Wolfe's beer. The only light came from the small rhythmic glow of the metronome's brass gears, sparking with a faint, ghostly friction as the mechanism turned. Then the sound began. It wasn't the choral harmony I'd heard on the stoop. It was a recording, etched onto a hidden wax cylinder inside the metronome's housing. It was a single violin, played with a frantic, weeping intensity that made the hair on my arm stand up. Over the melody, a voice began to speak. A dry, academic voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. It was Julian Thorne, and he was naming names. Wolfe sat in the center of the darkness, his silhouette a mountain of immovable judgment. He didn't need to see the suspects. He could hear their breathing, which had turned into a ragged, syncopated rhythm of panic. The symphony of suspicion was no longer a metaphor. Thorne's voice was detailing the night in 1944 when his music was acquired by the Varney family, not through patronage, but through a forced signature while he was under the influence of the very digitalis that eventually stopped his heart. He named the elder Vane, and he named the young assistant who had witnessed the deed, Arthur Sterling's father. The resonance of a crime, Wolfe's voice rumbled through the dark, is often louder than the crime itself. "Mr. Sterling, you didn't want to destroy the black version because it was a curse. You wanted to destroy it because it contains the evidence of your father's complicity in a grand larceny of the soul. You have been paying the Vanne ghost in the alley for 40 years to keep him from bringing this metronome to a lawyer. But tonight, the debt came due." Beatrice Thorne let out a sharp, jagged cry. "He stole it! He stole the music we owned. My branch of the family was left with nothing while the Vanes built a palace on Julian's blood." "You were not left with nothing, Beatrice," Wolfe said, the coldness in his voice enough to freeze the air. "You were left with the publishing rights to the lesser works, which you have been selling off piece by piece to satisfy your appetite for Tsarina jewels. You knew about the metronome. You were the one who contacted the man in the theatre coat, offering him a share of the Midnight Carol if he would help you retrieve the key from my desk. You used the blackout at the townhouse as a rehearsal for the theft you committed here under my roof." The violin on the recording hit a high, discordant note that sounded like a scream. I could hear someone shifting in their chair, the Vance twins, likely trying to find the door in the dark. But I was standing there, and they weren't going anywhere. "And the experts," Wolfe continued, his voice relentless. "Dr. Graves, you didn't just write a book claiming that Carol was a myth. You were paid by the Varney Foundation to ensure that any mention of Julian Thorne's final days was treated as the rambling of a lunatic. You didn't just suppress the music, you suppressed the man. You are not a musicologist, you are a mortician of the arts." The lights came back when I hit the switch. The transition was brutal. The 6 people in the room looked like they had been caught in a flashbulb, their faces pale and stripped of their Victorian masks. Arthur Sterling was hunched over, his head in his hands. Beatrice Thorne stared at the metronome like it was a ticking bomb. The Vance twins looked like they were ready to dissolve into the floorboards. Elena Vane was the only one who didn't look away. She was staring at Wolfe, her eyes brimming with a mixture of grief and a terrible, cold clarity. "It was all a lie," she whispered. "The foundation, the gala, the legacy, it was all built on a murder. Not a murder of the flesh, Miss Vane, but a murder of the intellect," Wolfe said, his eyes finally opening. He looked at the suspects with a disgust so profound it seemed to fill the room. "You all came here tonight hoping that I would be the final seal on the tomb. You expected me to find a thief so that the conspiracy could remain intact. Instead, you have found a mirror, and none of you can bear the reflection. Wolfe turned to the metronome and silenced it with a single, decisive flick of his finger. The silence that followed was worse than the discord. It was the silence of a grave that had finally been emptied. He looked at the clock, 12:08 a.m. The gala at the Waldorf was likely starting its final movement, but the real performance had just ended here on 35th Street. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping back into its normal, businesslike tone. Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a room full of people who have been misrepresenting the ownership of a major cultural asset for 4 decades, and tell him to bring a large car. Our guests are no longer in the mood for caroling. I headed for the phone. The symphony of suspicion had reached its final chord, and for the inner circle, the music was finally over. Nero Wolfe sat in his chair, the conductor of a justice that didn't need a baton, only the truth. The office felt like the inside of a bell that had just been struck and was still vibrating with a low, painful hum. Inspector Cramer had arrived with a squad that looked distinctly unhappy about being pulled away from their own holiday dinners. But the sight of the Vane Foundation board, huddled in their Victorian capes, like a flock of grounded crows, seemed to cheer him up. He'd taken Arthur Sterling, Beatrice Thorne, Dr. Graves, and the Vance twins into custody, not for murder, though the DA would be looking into the digitalis, but for the systematic fraud and suppression of the Thorne legacy. Elena Vane had gone with them, not as a prisoner, but as a woman who had finally decided to set her own house on fire to see by the light of it. That left the 3 of us, Wolfe, the silver metronome, and me. The final resolution was no longer a musical term, it was the state of the room. The air was cold, the scent of the ghost's tattered velvet still lingering near the service door, and the weight of 80 years of stolen music finally coming to rest on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the silver pendulum that was now still, his fingers interlaced over his middle. He looked like a man who had just finished a particularly difficult crossword puzzle and found the final word to be inevitable. "The resolution, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration in the quiet. "It was never about the manuscript. A manuscript is merely paper and ink. It can be burned, hidden, or forged. The truth of Julian Thorne was stored in the one place where physics meets art, the metronome. To a composer, time is the only absolute. By encoding his confession into the very device that governed his rhythm, he ensured that only someone who understood the tempo of his life could hear the truth. The Vaners tried to steal the harmony, but they couldn't stop the beat." I leaned against my desk, watching the snow continue to pile up against the window. So the man in the theatre coat, the ghost, was really a Vane, or just a very dedicated fan of minor thirds? He was the youngest Vane brother, Thomas, Wolfe murmured, the one they committed to the same sanitarium as Thorne to keep the family bloodline pure. He wasn't a thief, Archie. He was a courier. He had been waiting for decades for someone in that family to have the courage to find the secret compartment. When Elena found the manuscript, he knew the time had come to return the key. He didn't follow them here to stop us. He followed them to ensure that I was the one who listened. He knew that the Vane board would attempt to use my office as a sanctuary for their secrets. He simply provided the climax they were trying to avoid. "It was a hell of a performance," I said, thinking of the high, thin whistle in the hallway. "But why the black version? Why make the music a curse? Because a curse is the only thing a greedy man fears more than a deficit," Wolfe remarked, his eyes half closing. Julian Thorne knew that people like Arthur Sterling and Dr. Graves would eventually find his music. He didn't write a carol, he wrote a mechanical indictment. He knew that by the time the metronome was opened, the people in that room would be so consumed by their own guilt that they would hear the music as a death knell. The black version was a psychological mirror. They didn't hear a curse, they heard their own histories being narrated by a dead man. Wolfe reached out and touched the charred fragment of the manuscript. He didn't handle it with the reverence of a musicologist. He handled it with the cold, clinical respect of a man who has seen too many legacies built on the bones of the talented. "The final resolution, Archie, is that the music will now be performed, but not at the Waldorf and not for the benefit of the Vane Foundation. It will be performed in a public concert hall, and the proceeds will go to the sanitarium where Thorne and the ghost were abandoned." The harmony was restored, but the price of the ticket was 80 years of silence. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 1 in the morning. The midnight Carol Conundrum was officially closed, and the city was finally falling into a true Christmas sleep. The brownstone felt sacred again, the trespassers gone, and the discord resolved, but I could still hear that violin in my head, the weeping, frantic melody that had cut through the darkness of the office. The DA is going to have fun with the medical records from '44, I noted. If they can prove the digitalis was part of a forced signature, they might get Graves and Sterling for more than just fraud. It's a long shot, but Cramer seemed to have a bit of the holiday spirit when he saw those ledger notes. Spirit has nothing to do with it, Archie. It is a matter of cumulative weight, Wolfe said, standing up with a sudden, surprising grace. The Vane family spent 40 years adding weight to a lie. Tonight, the lie became too heavy for the foundation to support. The collapse was inevitable. Now, if why? Oh, please, tell Fritz that the pigs in blankets I requested earlier are no longer sufficient. I find that resolving a major cultural tragedy leaves me with a remarkably keen appetite for something substantial. Perhaps the cold sliced turkey and a glass of the Montrachet. I headed for the kitchen, the rhythm of my own footsteps feeling strangely in time with the silence of the house. The ghost was gone, the music was found, and Nero Wolfe was ready to return to the only reality that truly mattered, the next meal. The conductor's silence was over, and the final note had been a perfect, uncompromising truth. The following morning the brownstone had reclaimed its usual atmosphere of heavy, scholarly peace. As if the ghosts of the Varney Music Foundation had been exorcised by the mere act of scrubbing the office floor. The sun was hitting the back of the house, casting long golden rectangles across the parquet where, only hours ago, the inner circle had stood in judgment of themselves. I had spent the early hours at the precinct dealing with the kind of paperwork that makes you wish you'd taken up a simpler profession, like ice harvesting in the Yukon. By the time I walked back into the office at 11, the city outside was humming with its usual chaotic energy, but inside, the air was as still as a frozen pond. Wolfe was in his chair, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the silver metronome, which now sat in its rightful place on the mantel, its pendulum motionless. He midnight carol manuscript was gone, taken as evidence by two men from the district attorney's office who looked like they'd never seen a piece of music that didn't have a subpoena attached. In its place was a fresh bottle of beer and a small, delicate sprig of an orchid I didn't recognize, something Theodore had brought down to signal that the world was once again focused on things that grew rather than things that were suppressed. The DA is happy, Wolfe, I said, tossing my hat onto the rack and sliding into my chair. Cramer says Arthur Sterling is singing louder than the choir did on our stoop. He's naming names and providing dates for every audit he faked since the Truman administration. They've got Beatrice Thorne on a conspiracy charge for the key theft. And Dr. Graves is currently trying to convince a lawyer that his book was a theoretical exercise rather than a paid cover-up. It's a regular festival of finger-pointing. Wolfe didn't look up. He poured his beer with a steady hand, the head forming a perfect creamy inch at the top of the glass. The happiness of the district attorney is a matter of supreme indifference to me, Archie. Solution integrity is what matters. A problem has been posed, its variables have been analyzed, and its conclusion has been reached. The fact that it also happens to involve the dismantling of a cultural parasite's empire is merely a pleasant side effect. Pleasant for us, maybe. Not so much for the Varney estate, I noted. They're currently at a hotel in Midtown, wondering if they're going to be the next ones to be audited by the public. Elena Vane told me to tell you that she's never going to host another gala as long as she lives, which might be the only good thing to come out of this entire mess. She's donating the townhouse to the city as a conservatory for young composers. Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean skepticism. Miss Vane is a woman who preferred the comfort of a gilded title to the effort of a genuine moral compass. She was the chairman of a vanity project, and she was content to stay in the dark as long as the diamonds were shiny. She deserves her headache. It is a small price to pay for the audacity of allowing her associates to use this house as a warehouse for their secrets. Fritz came in then, carrying a tray with a small covered dish and a fresh pot of coffee. He looked at the spot where the metronome had been opened and gave the rug a suspicious squint, as if he expected a puddle of melted deception to manifest out of thin air. "Everything is in order, Archie?" he asked, his voice a comfortingly domestic baritone. As in order as it ever gets, Fritz, I said, leaning back. The air is clear, the music has been found, and the only things left in this house that are loud are the sirens 3 blocks away. Fritz nodded, satisfied, and retreated to the kitchen. A few minutes later the elevator groaned, that familiar sound of the mountain returning to the plains, and the rhythmic thud of Wolfe's footsteps signaled the end of his midday session. He had spent the last hour with the orchids, a ritual that always seems to reset his internal clock after a brush with the ugliness of human ambition. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration, tell Saul that his bonus for the research at the engraving shop will be processed this afternoon, and remind him, if he ever again brings me a lead involving a man in a tattered velvet coat, I shall expect him to provide a more sophisticated explanation for the smell of mothballs on his evidence. I'll tell him, I said, smiling at my typewriter, but I think he's more worried about the cold he caught while standing in that alley. He says his nose feels like it's been through a meat locker. Wolfe settled back into his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He looked at the clock on the mantel, then at the silver metronome. The midnight carol conundrum was a lesson in the dangers of the fixed idea, Archie. Arthur Sterling believed his father's reputation could buy silence. Julianne Thorne believed her debt could be erased by a theft of history. They all forgot that the truth is the only ingredient that cannot be substituted in the kitchen of justice. It has a way of surfacing, even when it has been frozen in a block of 80-year-old silence. He reached for his book, a thick volume on the history of the Silk Road, and I knew the case was officially filed away in the archives of his mind. The midnight carol was no longer a mystery, it was a memory, and for Wolfe, memories are only useful if they can be used to solve the next problem. I stood up and went to the window, looking out at the street. The afternoon traffic was picking up, and a delivery truck was double-parked near the corner. It was a normal, noisy, chaotic Manhattan day. The ghost was gone, the air was clear, and Nero Wolfe was back in his world, where the only thing that mattered was the next meal and the next bloom. It was a good day to be alive on West 35th Street, even if the world was a little less musical than it had been yesterday. And Archie, Wolfe's voice drifted from behind the book. Yeah, tell Fritz that for lunch tomorrow I should like the braised short ribs with the horseradish reduction. My palate requires something sharp after the cloying sweetness of Elena Vane's Victorian carolers. Short ribs and horseradish, I repeated, heading for the kitchen. I think we can manage that, just as long as we don't have to listen to any minor thirds while we eat. The office door closed behind me, sealing in the silence. The case was finished, the accounts were settled, and the only thing left to do was wait for the doorbell to ring again.